For 3 months, employees complained about the slow janitor who asked too many questions. The day they tried to get him fired, they discovered he was their boss. But this story doesn't start with a mop and bucket. It starts with a promise made to a dying woman in a hospital room and a man who never forgot where he came from. The fluorescent lights of Fresh Mart's supermarket cast everything in harsh white shadows at 2:47 a.m. In the maze of grocery aisles, where the day's chaos had been temporarily tamed, Frank Martinez pushed his yellow mop bucket with the steady rhythm of someone who had learned that good work didn't need to be fast work. At 71, Frank moved with deliberate care. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle like it was an extension of himself, and his faded blue uniform hung loose on his compact frame. The name tag pinned to his chest read simply Frank in block letters. No last name, no title, nothing to suggest he was anything more than what he appeared to be. Behind the customer service counter, night shift supervisor Tanya Williams rolled her eyes as she watched Frank methodically clean each tile. At 28, Tanya had been working retail long enough to spot every type of employee, and Frank was clearly the type who'd never understand that time was money. "Frank," she called out, her voice echoing off the empty shelving, "you've been working on aisle 7 for 20 minutes. It's just spilled juice, not a crime scene." Frank looked up, his dark eyes patient behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You're right, Tanya. But someone's grandmother is going to walk down this aisle tomorrow morning. She deserves a clean floor, don't you think?" Tanya shook her head and returned to her inventory sheets. 3 months Frank had been working nights, and he was still giving her philosophy lessons about mopping floors. It was exhausting. What Tanya didn't know was that Frank had been in this exact store 47 years ago, not as an employee, but as a 10-year-old boy counting quarters with his mother to see if they could afford milk and bread for the week. He remembered the shame in his mother's eyes when she had to put back the name-brand cereal, the way she smiled anyway and told him the store brand tasted just as good. He remembered promising himself that if he ever had power, he'd make sure stores like this treated customers with dignity, regardless of how much money they had to spend. Frank had been CEO of the Fresh Mart chain for 12 years, but he'd been working these night shifts for 3 months under his mother's maiden name. What he'd discovered kept him awake during the day, planning changes that went far beyond mopping schedules. As he worked, Frank listened to everything: the way night shift employees talked about management, the complaints about scheduling, pay, working conditions, the casual cruelty some employees showed toward others they considered beneath them. Tonight, he was listening to Derek and Melissa, 2 stockers who were supposed to be restocking a cereal aisle, but instead were debating whether the new janitor was worth keeping around. "I'm telling you, the old guy is weird," Derek said, ripping open a case of cornflakes with unnecessary force. "Always asking questions about how we do things, why we do them that way. Like, dude, you push a mop. Stay in your lane." Melissa nodded, stacking boxes with mechanical precision. "And he's so slow. Takes him twice as long to clean a spill as it should. Tanya's getting complaints from the day shift about areas not being properly cleaned." Frank continued mopping, his face showing no reaction to the conversation happening 20 feet away. But in his mind, he was making notes. Derek had been written up twice for leaving work areas messy when his shift ended. Melissa had never once stayed past her scheduled time to help with urgent tasks, even when the store was short-staffed. Neither of them knew that Frank had implemented the company's profit-sharing program that had increased their paychecks by 12% this year. "Maybe we should talk to Tanya about it, like document his performance issues, build a case." Frank wrung out his mop and moved to the next section, but he was listening to every word. In his 12 years as CEO, he'd learned that real leadership meant understanding how decisions affected people at every level. But tonight, he was learning something else: how people talked about each other when they thought no one important was listening. By week 10 of Frank's janitor experiment, the complaints had reached a crescendo. Tanya had started keeping a notebook of Frank's performance issues, The way he spent too long talking to customers, asked too many questions about store policies, and seemed more interested in understanding how things worked than simply doing his assigned tasks. What the night shift didn't know was that Frank's chatting with customers was actually market research. He'd learned more about customer satisfaction in 10 weeks of mopping floors than he had in years of corporate surveys and focus groups. Like Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who came in every Tuesday night because she couldn't sleep and the store felt safer than her empty apartment. She'd told him how much she appreciated that the floors were always clean, how small kindnesses from store employees made her feel less invisible. Or James, the young father who shopped after midnight because it was the only time he could get childcare. He'd mentioned to Frank how much he appreciated employees who didn't make him feel rushed or judged for using food stamps. These conversations had already influenced 3 corporate policy changes, though none of the night shift employees knew it yet. Tonight, Frank was restocking paper towels in aisle 12 when he overheard a conversation that would change everything. "I'm done with this," Derek announced to anyone within earshot. "The old man asked me yesterday why we don't carry more organic produce. Like, what's he care? He's a janitor." Tanya looked up from her clipboard. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to worry about his own job before he starts managing the whole store." Melissa laughed. "Honestly, someone needs to put him in his place. All these questions, like he thinks he's some kind of consultant or something." Frank continued his work, but something had shifted in the air around him. The casual dismissal in their voices, the assumption that asking questions was somehow inappropriate for someone in his position, the clear hierarchy they'd constructed where his curiosity was seen as insubordination. It reminded him of another conversation, years ago, when he was a stock boy at a different chain. His supervisor then had said almost exactly the same things about the uppity Mexican kid who asked too many questions. Frank had promised himself then that if he ever had power, he'd create workplaces where curiosity was rewarded, not punished, where asking questions was seen as engagement, not insubordination. Tonight he realized it was time to find out if he had kept that promise. Week 12 brought the incident that would change everything. Frank was cleaning the employee break room when he noticed the schedule posted on the bulletin board. 3 people were working short shifts, barely getting enough hours to qualify for benefits. 2 were single mothers. He found Tanya restocking the pharmacy section and approached him with his characteristic careful politeness. "Tanya, I noticed some folks are scheduled pretty light this week. Is there anything I can do to help pick up extra hours?" Tanya stopped counting pill bottles and fixed Frank with an exasperated look. "Frank, you're part-time night custodial. You don't get to worry about other people's schedules." "I just thought..." "You thought maybe you could solve everyone's problems by mopping harder?" Tanya's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd been pushed past her limit. "Look, I don't know what your deal is, but you've been here 3 months and you still don't understand your role. Your role is to clean floors and empty trash cans. That's it. Not to chat with customers about organic produce, not to ask questions about scheduling, not to act like you understand how this business works." The break room had gone quiet. Derek and Melissa were pretending to eat their lunches while straining to hear every word. 2 other employees had paused in their tasks, sensing drama. "I understand," Frank said quietly. "I was just trying to help." "Well, stop trying to help. Start doing your actual job." Frank nodded and returned to his cart. But something fundamental had shifted. For 3 months, he'd been learning about his company from the ground up. Tonight, he learned something that no corporate survey could have taught him: how quickly respect could turn to contempt when people felt threatened by questions they couldn't answer. That night, Frank went home to his modest apartment and made a phone call that would change everything. Frank's apartment was a study in intentional simplicity. Despite having a net worth that could have afforded him any luxury, he lived in the same 2-bedroom unit he'd rented when he first moved to the city 30 years ago. The walls were covered with photos: his late wife Maria, his 3 grown children, and dozens of images from Fresh Mart stores across the region. But the photo on his nightstand told the real story: a faded color snapshot of a thin woman in a hospital bed holding the hand of a younger Frank. Maria Martinez, 3 days before cancer took her away, making her husband promise something that would define the rest of his life. "Promise me, Frank," she had whispered, her voice already weakened by treatments that hadn't worked. "When you have power, really have power, promise me you'll remember what it felt like to be powerless." Frank had started Fresh Mart with money he borrowed against their house and a vision of grocery stores that treated every customer with dignity. But somewhere in the growth from 1 store to 47 stores, he'd lost touch with the daily reality of the people who made his success possible. 3 months ago, he'd made a decision that his board of directors still didn't know about. He'd taken a leave of absence, created a false identity using Maria's maiden name, and applied for a night janitor position at the store where it all began. Now, as he sat in his simple apartment reviewing the notebook where he documented every conversation, every success hadn't corrupted him exactly, but it had insulated him from the daily indignities that his lowest-paid employees faced. Tonight, that insulation was coming off. The phone call he made was to his assistant, a woman who'd been with the company for 8 years and was one of the few people who knew where he'd been spending his nights. "Linda, it's Frank. I need you to schedule a surprise inspection of store number 1 for tomorrow night. Full corporate team. Tell them it's routine, but make sure Tanya Williams knows we're coming." "Sir, is everything all right?" Frank looked at the photo of Maria, remembering her gentle strength, her way of treating every person she met like they mattered. "Everything's about to be all right, Linda, for the first time in a long time." The next evening started like any other night shift at Fresh Mart store number 1. Frank arrived at his usual time, punched in at the employee time clock, and collected his mop and bucket from the custodial closet. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like a reckoning 47 years in the making. Tanya was particularly sharp with him during the shift briefing, clearly still irritated by their conversation from the night before. "Frank, I need you to focus tonight. Corporate is doing a surprise inspection, and I don't need you slowing things down with your usual," she waved her hand dismissively, "whatever it is you do." Derek snorted. "Maybe they'll finally see what we've been dealing with." Melissa nodded. 3 months of trying to work around the slowest janitor in retail history. Frank listened without comment, but he noticed something he'd missed before. The way they talked about corporate like it was a distant enemy, something to be survived rather than supported. The assumption that his thoroughness was incompetence rather than care. At 11:47 p.m., Frank was mopping the produce section when the front doors opened and 5 people in business attire walked in. Even in the harsh fluorescent lighting, they carried themselves with the unmistakable authority of people accustomed to being heard. Linda Peterson, his assistant and VP of Operations, Robert Chen, the regional manager, Sandra Williams, head of Human Resources, Miguel Santos, the director of store operations, and bringing up the rear, Jennifer Martinez, his own daughter, and the company's chief financial officer. Frank continued mopping, but he was watching everything. The way Tanya immediately straightened her posture and smoothed her uniform. The way Derek and Melissa suddenly became very busy with their assigned tasks. The way the entire energy of the store shifted when real power walked through the doors. Linda approached Tanya first, her smile professional but warm. "Miss Williams, I'm Linda Peterson from corporate. We're here for a routine store inspection." "Of course," Tanya replied, her voice suddenly an octave higher. "Everything's running smoothly tonight. Let me show you around." As the group began their tour, Frank pushed his cart to the edge of their path, close enough to hear, but far enough away to remain invisible. It was a position he'd perfected over 3 months of being overlooked. "Employee morale seems good," Robert observed, watching Derek stack cereal boxes with unusual efficiency. "Oh yes, we have a great team here, very dedicated employees."
Frank almost smiled. If they only knew what dedicated employees said when they thought no one important was listening. The inspection continued through the store, with Tanya playing the role of the competent night supervisor, highlighting the hard work and professionalism of her team. Frank continued his methodical cleaning, staying just close enough to observe the performance. It was Jennifer who noticed him first. Even in the harsh store lighting, even with 12 hours of executive meetings behind her, she recognized something familiar in the careful way the janitor moved through his tasks. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying across the produce section. Frank looked up, his expression politely attentive. "Yes, ma'am?" "You're very thorough in your work. How long have you been with Freshmart?" "About 3 months now. Still learning the ropes." Tanya interjected quickly. "Frank's our night custodian. He's very dedicated to his work." The way she said dedicated made it clear it wasn't entirely a compliment. Linda stepped closer, studying Frank's face with growing recognition. Frank Martinez? The name hung in the air like a question that changed everything. Tanya looked confused, glancing between Linda and the janitor she'd been managing for 3 months. Derek stopped stacking boxes. Melissa forgot to pretend she was busy. The corporate team formed a loose semicircle around Frank, their expressions shifting from polite interest to something much more complex. "Yes," Frank said simply, setting down his mop and straightening to his full height. "Frank Martinez." The silence stretched until Jennifer stepped forward, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Dad, what are you doing here?" The word hit the store like a thunderclap. "Dad." Suddenly, the janitor wasn't just Frank anymore. He was someone's father, someone important enough that a corporate executive called him Dad. But they still didn't understand. Not yet. Tanya's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't understand." Linda Peterson, who had been Frank's assistant for 8 years, who had scheduled this inspection knowing exactly what it would reveal, stepped forward with the explanation that would change everything. "Tanya, I'd like you to meet Frank Martinez. He's the founder and CEO of Freshmart." The words landed like physical blows. Tanya's clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Derek's mouth opened and closed without sound. Melissa grabbed the edge of a shelf for support. 3 months of casual dismissal, of eye rolls and condescending comments, of treating him like an inconvenience, suddenly took on a weight that threatened to crush them all. "Mr. Martinez," Tanya stammered, her face cycling through shades of red that had no names. "I had no idea. Your application said—" "My application said Frank Martinez, night custodial," which was accurate. "I've been working nights here for 3 months, learning about my company from the ground up." Robert Chen, who had been silent during the revelation, found his voice. "Sir, this is highly unusual. Is there something specific you were investigating?" Frank picked up his mop again, not to use it, but because holding it reminded him of the lessons he'd learned over the past 3 months. "I wasn't investigating anything, Robert. I was learning what it feels like to be treated as invisible, learning how employees talk about management when they think no one important is listening, learning whether the company I built still remembers the values it was founded on." He looked directly at Tanya, his expression kind but serious. "And I learned that we have some significant problems." Derek tried to speak. "Mr. Martinez, if we said anything—" "You said exactly what you meant to say, Derek. All of you did. And that's the problem." Frank set the mop against his cart and addressed the group, but his words were meant for everyone in the store. 3 months ago, I started working here because I wanted to understand if Freshmart was still the company my wife and I dreamed of building. A place where every employee was treated with dignity, where asking questions was encouraged, where doing your job well mattered more than doing it fast. He gestured around the store, taking in the aisles he'd cleaned for 3 months, the employees who'd dismissed him, the space where he'd learned uncomfortable truths about his own company. And tonight, I found out who we really are. Linda Peterson stepped forward, her role as VP of Operations kicking in. "Sir, what would you like us to do?" Frank looked around the store one more time, seeing it not as the CEO, but as the janitor who'd been dismissed and overlooked for 3 months. "First, I want to talk to every employee individually, not as punishment, but as education. They need to understand that every person in this building contributes to our success, regardless of their title or their uniform." Tanya found her voice, though it shook. "Mr. Martinez, I am so sorry. If I had known—" "That's exactly the problem, Tanya. Your behavior shouldn't change based on who you think someone is. Respect should be the default, not something earned by title or position." Frank turned to address Derek and Melissa, who were standing frozen by the cereal display. "Derek, you told me to stay in my lane. You said I was asking too many questions for someone who just pushes a mop. But asking questions is how we improve. Curiosity is how we grow. And every employee, regardless of their position, has insights that can make this company better."
Derek's face was pale. "Sir, I didn't mean—" "You meant exactly what you said. And now you understand why that's a problem." Frank looked at Melissa. "You complained that I was slow, that I spent too much time on each task. But Mrs. Chen, who shops here every Tuesday night, told me that clean floors make her feel safe. James, who comes in after midnight, told me that employees who take pride in their work make him feel welcome. Speed isn't always more important than care." Jennifer, who had been watching her father with a mixture of pride and concern, stepped closer. "Dad, what do you want to change?" Frank smiled at his daughter, the expression transforming his face from tired executive to proud father. "Everything, Mija, starting with the way we treat each other." Over the next hour, Frank conducted individual conversations with each night shift employee. Not interrogations, but teaching moments. Opportunities for people to understand how their actions affected others, how their words carried weight they might not have realized. With Tanya, he was patient but firm. "You're a good supervisor, Tanya. Your inventory management is excellent. Your scheduling is efficient. But leadership isn't just about managing tasks. It's about managing people. And managing people means treating everyone with basic dignity." Tanya nodded, tears in her eyes. "I understand, Mr. Martinez. I really am sorry." "I don't need your apology, Tanya. I need your commitment to do better. Can you give me that?" "Yes, sir. Absolutely." With Derek, Frank was more direct. "Derek, you've been here 2 years. In that time, you've received 3 raises and been promoted to Silver Stock Clerk. Do you know why?" Derek shook his head. "Because you're good at your job when you want to be. But being good at your job isn't enough if you're not good to the people you work with. Respect isn't optional, it's required." "I understand, Mr. Martinez. It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't." With Melissa, Frank found common ground. "Melissa, you mentioned that you're studying business management at the community college. Is that true?" "Yes, sir. Night classes." "That's impressive. Balancing work and school takes dedication. What do you want to do with your degree?" "I'd like to move into retail management someday." Frank nodded. "Good. Managers understand that their job is to bring out the best in every employee. They don't dismiss people based on their position or their appearance. They look for potential everywhere. Can you be that kind of manager?" "Yes, sir. I want to be. Then we'll talk about some opportunities for you to develop those skills. As the corporate team prepared to leave, Frank gathered his cleaning supplies one last time. Tomorrow night, he wouldn't be back as the janitor, but the lessons he'd learned over 3 months would stay with him forever. Linda approached him as he returned his mop to the custodial closet. "Sir, that was intensive. Are you satisfied with the results?" Frank considered the question. Around them, the night shift employees were working with a different energy. More awareness, more consideration for each other, more understanding of how their individual actions contributed to the whole. "Ask me in 6 months," Frank replied. "Real change takes time." Jennifer, who had been watching her father with a mixture of pride and concern, stepped closer. "Dad, I have to ask, was this worth it? 3 months of being treated like you were invisible?" Frank looked back at the store, seeing it through new eyes, not just as the CEO who built an empire, but as the janitor who remembered what it felt like to be dismissed, overlooked, treated as less than human. "Your mother made me promise something, Mija. She made me promise that if I ever had real power, I'd remember what it felt like to be powerless. Tonight, I kept that promise." They walked out into the cool night air, father and daughter, CEO and CFO, but also 2 people who understood that real leadership meant never forgetting where you came from. Behind them, store number 1 continued its night shift operations, but something fundamental had changed. In the break room, Derek was helping a new employee understand the cleaning procedures. In aisle 7, Melissa was patiently answering a customer's questions about organic produce. At the customer service counter, Tanya was reviewing the employee schedule, looking for ways to give people more hours. Small changes, but changes that would ripple outward like stones dropped in still water. 6 months later, Frank returned to store number 1. This time, he came as himself, the CEO, but he carried with him the memories of being Frank, the janitor. The changes were immediately visible. Employee turnover was down 60%. Customer satisfaction scores were the highest in the region. The store had been nominated for a company-wide Excellence Award. But the real change was in the details. The way employees greeted every customer with genuine warmth, regardless of how they were dressed or how much they were spending. The way questions were encouraged and curiosity was rewarded instead of dismissed. The way the night shift worked together as a team, with experienced employees mentoring new ones instead of complaining about them. Tanya had been promoted to assistant store manager, and her first initiative was a peer mentoring program that paired new employees with experienced ones. Derek had become the store's unofficial training coordinator, using his experience to help new stockers learn not just how to do their jobs, but how to do them with pride. Melissa had been accepted to the company's management training program and was on track to become an assistant manager within a year. But the biggest change was in Frank himself. He'd instituted a policy requiring all corporate executives to spend 1 week per year working entry-level positions in different stores, not as publicity stunts, but as genuine learning experiences. "You can't lead people you don't understand," he told his executive team. "And you can't understand people you never spend time with." As Frank walked through the store, he stopped at the employee break room, where a new photo had been added to the bulletin board. It showed the night shift team from 6 months ago, the night of the revelation. Frank was in the center, still in his janitor uniform, surrounded by employees who had learned the same lesson he had. Everyone matters. Everyone has value. Everyone deserves respect. The photo was labeled, "The Night We Remembered Who We Are." Frank smiled and continued his tour, but he wasn't just seeing the store anymore. He was seeing the people who made it work. People who came to work every night and did their jobs with pride because they knew their efforts were seen and valued. People who asked questions because curiosity was encouraged. People who took time to do things right because quality mattered more than speed. People who treated every customer and every coworker with dignity because that's what human beings deserved. At the front of the store, Frank paused by the customer service counter where a new sign had been posted. At Fresh Mart, every employee matters, every customer matters, and every interaction is an opportunity to show that we care. Below it, in smaller text, ask questions, take your time, do it right, be kind. It wasn't a corporate slogan, it was a promise. A promise that Frank had made to his dying wife, kept through 3 months of being invisible, and would honor for the rest of his life. That night, Frank went home to his simple apartment and opened the notebook where he had recorded his observations as a janitor. On the last page, he wrote, "Day 180, post-revelation. The lesson isn't that respect must be earned. The lesson is that respect must be given. To everyone, always, without exception." He closed the notebook and looked at the photo of Maria on his nightstand. Her smile seemed brighter somehow, as if she approved of the man he had become and the promise he had kept. Outside his window, the city hummed with the quiet energy of people working night shifts in stores and offices and warehouses across the region. People who deserved to be seen, to be valued, to be treated with the dignity that every human being carried simply by being human. Frank had learned that lesson the hard way, by becoming invisible himself. But he'd learned it completely, and he'd use his power to make sure others learned it too. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remember what it feels like to be powerless. And sometimes the best way to lead is to start by learning how to follow.